Hello, everyone. Welcome back to CL 100. So, part two. Um, there's just a few things to say, and I wanted to stress a few points and better explain and show a few quotes as well. Because first part, I didn't show a whole lot of quotes. I'm not going to show a whole lot of quotes either, but I'll show a few of them. And I just wanted to. So we ended last time talking about Rousseau's optimism, as it were, right? His dream. And now I want to talk about his pessimism, the other side of the coin, right? He's mostly pessimistic, let's put it like this. He's skeptical and he's not as optimistic as Locke, as you must have noticed already. But last time, if there's any optimism at all, as I mentioned, that optimism of his is that small cities, small communities such as Geneva could potentially be the sort of direct democracy with participation, right? Which is the kind of society that he envisioned as being the ideal type of society. Um, and so again, he didn't see that happening in Paris where he lived. He didn't see that happening in most places in the world. He thought the world wasn't going in that direction mostly as cities kept growing. But there was some hope, right? Now, on the other hand, what could go wrong? Well, the main problem of his is his criticism of progress and our use of reason to try to always further develop our material interests, etc. Right? Because that led to excessive vanity with us comparing ourselves with other people, and that led to sadness, depression, etc. Right? That's more or less his idea that we would live a much better life if we weren't comparing each other with people all the time and living in this competitive society in that sense, right? So he argues, and the pages here that you see on my quotes obviously are not, they depend, of course, the bookers you're going to be using, and I'm providing you the free versions from Project Gutenberg. So you're not going to have page numbers there. If you're using that for your essay, then of course, when you use direct citations, you don't have to add the page number. That's okay. Just add at the end of your essay that the book version you're using is from Project Gutenberg. It's the one I've provided, and that's fine. So in that case, you wouldn't use page numbers. So I'm just explaining that. So he says, why is it that only men can become an imbecile, right? You probably heard the expression, all roads lead to Rome. And I thought, to paraphrase that saying, Rousseau is kind of saying that the same road, right, all roads, or in other words, the same road can lead you to completely different directions, right? This road of what he calls perfectibility, okay? He calls this perfectibility, your attempt of becoming better, okay? But it can be better at anything, right? So, for instance, you have Homer, the virtuous, right? The writer, the Greek one, and you have the other Homer, the vicious one, right? In other words, Homer also uses perfectibility, but the ability of he focuses on eating donuts or watching beer and right just watching television, etc. So human beings can specialize in anything they want, right, and they have their individuality, etc. Rousseau's is just saying that that same factor can lead in completely different directions. In his own words, this distinctive and almost unlimited faculty, that is, the faculty of perfectibility, is the source of all men's misfortunes, giving rise to his enlightenment and his errors, his vices and his virtues. Right? So, why am I bringing this to your attention? Remember the contrast we made with Aristotle, right? That Aristotle and Plato, Socrates, they place the reason, right, at the central stage, right? Man is a political animal, and he uses reason to develop her virtues and her sense of justice, etc., etc., her knowledge to become wise, right? Um, but Rousseau is saying that's just half of the story. Actually, perfectibility, which is not exactly reason, can lead to either enlightenment, right, or to errors, to vices or virtues, right? So it's this perfectibility is this natural inclination that you have to express yourself and create your own idea, right? To define your future and become whatever you want to become. You have your free will, right? But that same road, so all roads can lead you to the initial road is the same, right? That's the point here, and then you can end up in completely different places. So Blaze, right? So that's why to Rousseau, reason is not as important as it was to Aristotle. Reason is one of the possible outcomes, but it's not a necessary one, and it's not a natural inclination either, right? Because what's a natural inclination of mankind is emotions, right? What made animals different from us, right? What makes us unique human beings is that we can cry and we have the ability to have sympathy, right? To have pity. Rousseau is basically going to argue when I strip man naked, right? When I go back to the state of nature and see man as it actually is, the first thing that exists that makes man different, not reason, but pity, the ability to cry, to see someone else, and to be able to put yourself in that person's shoes, right? The ability to relate to someone else. He says that's the very, very first thing, really, much before reason or language, even, right? So, okay, so that's a couple of quotes to better explain that point. Why is he against Aristotle? And it's not that he's against reason, right? Obviously, he's also a product of enlightenment. He wrote an opera. He wrote several books. He was himself an intellectual, right? But basically, what he's just explaining is it's not that we all are endowed with reason and right, but that people will make different choices and basically he thinks that the modern world as he saw it, right, wasn't leading many people to take the good road, right, the road of enlightenment and wisdom and virtue. He thought that the world was so competitive and there was so much vanity that all of us ended up becoming stupid. We used our perfectibility, but not to become more virtuous, but just to become right, to try to, to compete with people all the time for things that aren't really, really that important, according to him. Your physical looks, etc., etc. So that's what Rousseau is arguing. Okay. Now, I want to move to the second point. Okay, about with the second. So if the heart, right, was or rather the brain, not the heart, but the brain, right, was the associated with Aristotle and the idea of reason, etc. And I'm saying that Rousseau is about the heart and the emotions, right? Then the third element that is missing is the property acquiring animal, right? Like John Locke argued, so the intestine, that would be, right? The instinct, greed, etc., which is related to the intestine. It's your hunger, your hunger, your will to eat and to even sexual drive. All of those things, Plato would argue, come from all of those human characteristics. They are related to the stomach or the intestine, right? So that's where your hunger comes from, etc. Your willpower, etc. Your drive. So that's why the workers, they are associated with the intestine, because in Plato's Republic, right? Because they were kind of the property acquiring animals that are greedy and right want to conquer, etc., etc. So Adam Smith made a similar argument to Locke. He argued that That's always been a characteristic of us in this passage. The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another is common to all men and to be found in no other race of animals. So interesting, right? In terms of what is it that makes us human beings, right? What's our main difference with animals? That's a discussion here, right? I'm saying Aristotle has one answer, Rousseau has another answer, and Locke has another answer. And Adam Smith's saying the same thing as Locke here, isn't he? What can be found in humans but not in any other animal is the propensity to truck, to exchange. So it's our that we are property animal, acquiring animals, right? That he's saying that by this is Adam Smith is wrong about this. I'll show you in a second some evidence that he's wrong. But or at least refer you to the books that you can read to understand why he's wrong. And so Locke was also wrong, of course, because they're making the same argument. But what they're making here, the argument he is making and Locke is making, is in some sense that we have always been capitalistic deep down, right? The propensity to truck, to exchange, we've always been looking for profit, for business opportunities, always, he's arguing, right? It's just that before capitalism, we didn't have the opportunities, Adam Smith's argument. But eventually, capitalism would emerge anyways, because that's just our nature. Okay, a lot of people think like that, believe Adam Smith. Not because he said it, but because that's the way we are nowadays. So for us, it's impossible to imagine how it was 1,000 years ago, right? For us, it's so normal that people want to get a better job, right? That you want to increase your income if you can, and that you want to buy a house, and then you want to, I'm not saying that you want to be a millionaire or anything like that, but for us, it feels very natural that we all at least want to improve, right? You guys are all studying, so you'll have a diploma, so you can get a better job. That's what you're trying to do, right? For us, that feels natural because that's part of our society, right? But people weren't like that if we go back before capitalism ever emerged, right? So Adam Smith that's anachronism. Again, I mentioned yesterday, that's the risk of anachronism. Adam Smith in Scotland was considered the wisest man to have existed since Aristotle. Okay, so they were saying, okay, Aristotle probably even smarter than Adam Smith, but after Aristotle, no one has come close to Adam Smith. That's what they thought of him. That's the sort of intellectual he was. So by no means I'm saying, look how stupid he is. No, everyone makes that mistake. All of us, I think, probably would have thought the same, unless we knew the evidence that shows that we were quite different. Okay, but I'll show you that in a second. So now, what does Rousseau have to say about this? That there's anachronism that I'm talking about right here. That's what he's alluding to. All of them, so the philosophers or the economists, okay, Hobbes, Smith, all of them speak continually of need, avarice, oppression, desires, and pride, have transferred to the state of nature the ideas they acquired in society, right? So just because you have shoes, right, you would say, it's impossible to walk. It's impossible to live without a phone, isn't it? We say that all the time. How would you even walk around without a Google Maps? You wouldn't know where to go. How do you drive without Google Maps? Don't we have that feeling? Without internet and a phone, how do you find places, etc., right? Find the shop that you want, etc., etc. So we think it's impossible, right? But it's only impossible to us because we're used to this, right? If we have shoes, then we think that people always wore shoes and it's impossible not to have shoes, right? Now that we are capitalistic, in other words, and that we are kind of, we are greedy and we have all the needs that we have, it's natural for us to think that people always were like that, but they weren't actually, okay? And Rousseau realizes this, okay? That's what he's saying here, that Hobbes, right? Hobbes is doing the same because he's saying a man is a wolf to another man, right? So Rousseau is saying, no, the savage man was great. They were kind and lovely and etc., right? Hobbes, you are transferring to them who you are, right? It's because in our times we are all killing each other and we are all in war. Nowadays, Rousseau is saying maybe a war of all against all, and just because now we are in a war of all against all, we think that hundreds or 1,000 years ago people were, in war all the time and they were selfish. No, they were probably very different from what we are. So Rousseau very interesting that he points this out, because we do have sociological and anthropological evidence that Rousseau is correct, that these guys are being anachronistic, but back then there wasn't any empirical evidence. So Rousseau knew this, with his intuition, without having read the books that we can now read, right? So he's saying Hobbes wrongly injected into the savage man's concern for self-preservation the need to satisfy a multitude of passions which are the product of society, right? These are the products of our society, our zeitgeist. I always use that word a lot, zeitgeist. I like it because it's exactly what Rousseau is saying, the spirit of our times. That's what the word means, right? It's the context, right? So we are products of our societies. Adam Smith or Hobbes, they are products of their societies. They have a multitude of passions that primitive men or the savage didn't have, right? So that's what he's pointing out here. Be careful. You guys are incorrect in your analysis of what the state of nature would have been like, right? That's why he depicts the state of nature differently from Hobbes, for instance. Okay. I probably read this passage. Although, again, the book I use is a printed version, is the version you can find on the syllabus, the cover there. So it's possible that my version is a little bit longer than the version you have online. But either way, you can obviously read the one I provided. But I'm just saying, my version has an introduction and, a few more stuff. So possibly if they're also... it's very different, okay? The translation is very different, the one I have and the one that is online. So it's completely different. It's the same meaning, but the words are completely different in the version I shared with you. I'm just pointing this out so you don't have to worry about, the peculiar words, or if you search for this, you won't even find it necessarily, okay, because it might be written differently. And some passages might not be in yours. I think you do have this one, if I'm not mistaken, though, because it's when he announces what he's going to do in the book, right? So this passage is very, very nice, where he says, "Listen, here's your story, as I have thought to read it, not in the books of your fellow men who are liars, but in nature who never lies." What does that mean, to read in nature? Do you guys remember also that passage last time of him kind of meditating, having his Buddha moment, right, under the tree and seeing everything, the true nature of reality, the essence of Plato, right, when he left the cave, etc. He had that moment of complete illumination, etc. But he's not even referring to that. He's saying that he's reading his history in nature, right? So not in the books, because books are written by men and men are biased and men tell the story the way they want to tell the story, right? The history is not necessarily the real history, right? It's not necessarily what the written history, right? And he's saying, look, Adam Smith or Hobbes, right? He's not referring to Adam Smith. I am, but it's the same mistake, right? The same mistake Hobbes is making to say that we are wolves to one another, that we are always greedy and trying to, right, sort of take advantage of each other, and etc., etc. He's saying, no, that's the stories that you've read, right, in the books of your fellow men, but they're lies. And I'll tell you the story that I read in nature, right, not in the books, but that I saw in the real, as I mentioned that story there, and but the story as it is in nature, as it actually is, right? In other words, I'll just tell you the history as it is, as it actually is in the real world, in nature, as it, again, the state of nature, and going back to the primitive emotions, etc. That's what he's explaining here, right? I'm going to show you, right? And here, very quick reference. Don't want to get into this because I want this video to be short. We had a very long first part. I just want to complement it really. So this is just for your reference. So Malinowski, this book, Argonauts of the Western Pacific. You remember last time that I was telling you, what if someone or a group of people were living isolatedly, right, and never had contact with capitalism, etc.? What would that tribe be like? Would they be selfish? Would they be cooperative? Neither. Maybe each person is different, right? And that's the question Malinowski asked, and he went to the Trobriand Islands, where there is this ring of islands here. There's a bunch of islands, and they trade and exchange, etc. And he studied their behaviors, right? This was a little bit over 100 years ago. But these people had lived until then, probably not now, but back then, in the early 20th century, they had lived in isolation. So Malinowski said, well, that's the one way to try to understand what people are in the state of nature like, right? Is it true that, as Adam Smith says, so Adam Smith is saying that we had this natural tendency for bartering, trucking, and exchanging. So in this island here, what is it like exchange? Are people accumulating, right, gold or whatever it is that they use, whatever means of exchange? But is it that we start seeing hierarchies and some islands getting rich and other against whatever, right? Are they trying to profit? How are exchanges based here? What are the human motivations that regulate exchange, right? Is it the same motivations we have today? So have we always been the same way? And Malinowski is going to argue that that's a fact, no. That when you look the behavior of these peoples, there's several islands as I mentioned, so it might be, and then he's saying basically the behavior of them is regulated by reciprocity, domesticity, and other human motivations, not greed or desire for profit or natural tendency to exchange at all. They behave completely differently from we do. Obviously, you would imagine that, but in terms of profit and how they don't have that idea of profit, of making a profit over an exchange. So basically what they do here is you don't produce trying to accumulate and to exchange, but if your island has an excess of whatever you do have, food or whatever, things you've produced, pots, etc., when you have an excess of those things, you give them as gifts to any other island, right? But what he notices is sometimes these guys here from Munawata will, from one of these islands, I'm not going to say the names because you cannot read, but one of these, let's say Island 1 donates something to Island 2, and then Island 2 will then donate something else to Island 3, right? Instead of giving back. It's not based on if I give you something, if my island gives you something, your island will feels a necessity to give back, etc. That notion of a gift is a completely different notion. That's the point here, right? And it's completely disassociated with making a profit or etc. It's considered noble to give to someone else, because if your tribe and your island were productive enough to accumulate and you have even an excess, then it's a good deed to give someone else. That's what motivate them in exchanging. And they end up trading, right? Because if everyone is gifting, they end up trading. But it's not that their natural inclination is to trade and they exchange because of that. Their natural inclination is to simply donate, right? To help their neighboring tribes or communities, and that leads to a process of trade. Okay, but obviously go read the book if you want to understand that better. That's not our point here. And this another one would be Marshall Sahlins, Stone Age Economics would be another book that studies human motivation in in the state of nature, as it were, but here not as a hypothetical, conjectural, right, philosophical model or method, right? Not as a thought experiment. These guys are actually looking at using ethnography and anthropology and studying isolated communities, etc. Right? So here is more empirical rather than abstract or theoretical. But one point about this book that is curious is that it also demonstrated that Rousseau is right about the sauvage in terms of the following. Rousseau says about the sauvage that his imagination, the sauvage's imagination, depicts nothing to him. His heart asks nothing of him. His modest needs are so easily found at hand that he can neither have foresight nor curiosity. He's arguing that the sauvage, and then he continues, let me explain later, let me just finish the quote. He continues, what kind of misery can there be for a free being whose heart is at peace and whose body is in good health? I ask if anyone has ever heard of a sauvage that killed himself. So Rousseau is saying, right, the sauvage didn't suicide, wasn't depressed, didn't have all of the problems that we have in modern society, really. These problems are coming not from our nature. We're not like that. We're not bound to be miserable like that by nature. Rousseau is saying it's actually the pressure of society that is leading us in that direction, right? That is leading us to take the bad road, as it were, rather than the more productive road, the road that makes you feel happier, that doesn't make you question yourself and who you are all the time, etc. He goes on, in this new state, with a simple and solitary life, very limited needs, and the tools they had invented to provide for them, since men enjoyed a great deal of leisure time. Indeed, in this book, and that's why I mentioned this book, Stone Age Economics, they mentioned that Stone Age people, they weren't societies of subsistence as we think of them. We tend to think of them as very poor people, right? Peoples. There are people all over the world, of course, right? Thousands of years ago. But essentially, obviously, they didn't have technology. Eventually, at some point, they didn't have even fridge or, right? You see the guy cooking here in this picture, making a fire, etc. So obviously, they were poor from that point of view. They didn't have any technology at all, etc., etc. No, their lives were very short, etc. So from that point of view, they were obviously our society has progressed enormously, right? But from another point of view, they were, Salins and others other anthropologists argue, they were an affluent society. Why? Because as Rousseau argues, they actually did have a great deal of leisure time. Their needs were very limited. So it's true, they didn't have money, they weren't rich, they didn't have technology, but they only had to work 4 hours a day on average, right? That's roughly what it would take for them to hunt and cook, etc. So they had a lot of leisure time, basically. From that point of view, they were more affluent than us, right? These anthropologists are simply pointing out to this interesting fact. We think that we are superior to them in every way, but we now are working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, and maybe thinking, I need more money, right? I mean, how many of us we have debt, and then we can't pay our debt, so we have to work and work and not necessarily even live an affluent life, right? A great part of society lives like that, right? So the sauvage man, as Rousseau is saying, and Salins has evidence, some empirical evidence, right? Ethnographic evidence studying communities, tribes, etc. It says, yes, indeed, they were affluent. They were affluent in terms of time, and they were affluent in the sense that their needs were easily satisfied. And that's why they probably, as Rousseau argued, wouldn't suicide or have depression, etc., right? Because they didn't have all of these impossible to fulfill desires, etc., etc. Okay. But then what happened, right? How did we go then from the state of nature through the, right? What happened? Because if we were an affluent society and everything was okay, what happened that we went went from the state of nature to the state of to the world that we are, right? How is it that it's changed? And we talked a little bit about this before, right? But just to explain a bit better, as Rousseau, as you can read here from the passage, he argues, well, okay, so men did enjoy a great deal of leisure time, but what happens over thousands of years is that little by little, they start procuring for themselves many types of conveniences unknown to their fathers, and that was the first yoke they impose on themselves without realizing, right? So it's a spontaneous and very, very slow process where little by little, well, if you only have to work 4 hours a day and you have a lot of free time, with that free time, you're probably, right, playing around, and you start inventing things and creating conveniences, etc., right? So you start creating these things, and that is your first yoke, right? That's not actually a good thing from Rousseau things, right? But you start, how today we are addicted to the internet and to the phone and to the social media, and said there's all these discussions. That's what Rousseau is pointing out to here. Right? That very primitive man there, as he starts creating things and tools and other stuff, and starts becoming a slave of his own inventions, essentially, right? Okay. Now, another interesting passage that explains that process a little bit is, as he argues, society and languages came into being on islands. People became accustomed to make comparisons. Imperceptibly, they acquired the ideas of merit and beauty. A sweet and tender feeling insinuates itself into the soul, and at least opposition becomes an impetuous fury. Jealousy awakens with love, discord triumphs, and the sweetest passion receives sacrifices of human blood. So initially we're in the state of nature and we're all kind and a bit, and what happened, right? Why is it that we start competing in each other? He's going to argue, well, slowly but surely throughout thousands and thousands of years, and on islands, right? Not on continents, because continents are so big that why would we fight with each other, right? In mainland Africa or Middle East, where societies, or China, where we have early societies. If you're in the continent and we're all good in principle, as Rousseau argued, there's no reason for us to compete, right? But on islands, you have limited land and population would keep growing, and eventually they start competing. They inevitably, right, just clash because their population just gets very big for the island, and they start creating hierarchy, and someone becomes the leader of the island, etc., etc. So that's his a hypothesis for how this happened, because otherwise you wouldn't explain, right? How did we go from good to bad, right? Well, population would grow until we were forced to live with each other, more or less, right? We became too big of a community there and started fighting and competing, etc. All right, that's about it. I'm just going to leave you with this last quote of Rousseau, which is not from this book, is from his other book, The Social Contract, but we talked a lot about the social contract, and hopefully now you understand this idea of his. He opens with that epigraph, his other book, Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, so maybe you understand that in the state of nature, we are free and equal and happy, etc., but right, at the end of the day, we are born free, but not really. We have the capacity to improve ourselves and be free and acquire freedom, but we are all victims of society, he's arguing, right? We're just incapable of understanding what really matters in life, and we keep following other people's ideas and end up not cultivating our own individuality and finding the good life, as it were. All right, that's about it. And next, we're going to be reading Stuart Mill next week. So I'll see you guys soon. Thank you very much.